I'm Maureen O'Connor, president of Palo Alto University. It's a pleasure to welcome you to our webinar series, At the Forefront of Mental Health. Palo Alto University is dedicated to addressing pressing and emerging mental health issues through research and training in the fields of psychology and counseling. In recognition of Pride Month, today's webinar will focus on LGBTQ+ youth and the mental health struggles they face in light of the pandemic, social and racial injustice, and increased barriers to support and mental health care. In a recent nationwide survey conducted by the Trevor Project, the leading national organization providing crisis intervention and suicide prevention for LGBTQ+ youth, 42% of LGBTQ+ youth seriously considered attempting suicide in the past year, and 94% reported that recent politics negatively impacted their mental health. Experts are just beginning to understand mental health impacts of the recent multiple crises on LGBTQ+ youth. Today's panel is here to help us better understand this important issue. And here to moderate this important conversation is ABC7's news reporter, Kate Larsen. Kate, we're delighted to have you back with us today at PAU to lead this important discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, President O'Connor, and happy Tuesday. California is reopening today, so I think we have so much to look forward to, so much to be excited about. I'm delighted to be here. I'm really grateful that Palo Alto University is holding these very important conversations. I want to introduce our expert panelists. Dr. Clark Osluis is a visiting professor at Palo Alto University, awarded the Counselor of the Year Award by the Ohio Counseling Association. Dr. Clark works with youth, adolescents, and young adults dealing with sexual and gender identity. Dr. M. Matsuno, a postdoctoral fellow at Palo Alto University, whose intervention research focuses on the support of trans individuals, minority stress and resilience among trans and non-binary people, parents of trans youth, and trans and non-binary graduate students. Their recent article on how parents can support their trans kids appeared in Yes Magazine. And Dr. Christy Jenkins, president-elect for the Society for Sexual, Affectional, Intersex, and Gender Expansive Identities, which is called SAGE, a division of the American Counseling Association. Dr. Jenkins is also the CEO of Family and Child Abuse Prevention Center in Toledo, Ohio. We've got three segments. The first segment is the problem, what we all need to address and how to make that happen. As young people to continue to adjust to the pandemic and other extraordinary events that have occurred within the past 15 or so months, some are dealing with increased anxiety and stress. And for those who are LGBTQ+ or questioning, those are additional challenges and risks that these young people face. So I want to ask our experts about how we can better understand the struggles that LGBTQ+ youth are experiencing as a result of the past year. I want to start with Dr. Jenkins, and Christy, we're hoping that you can share what you do and the mental health struggles that these youth are experiencing right now as a result of the past year, which has been hard on everyone.
Yes, so at the Family and Child Abuse Prevention Center here in Toledo, Ohio, we see children who have been sexually abused or families who have domestic violence in their households. And so unfortunately with the pandemic, folks were sheltering in place with their abusers. And so when we think about that, we think about your typical families. I don't know that we always think about folks from the LGBTQ+ population who might not be with affirming parents. And so now they're sheltering in place and hearing that day in and day out. And so there's a greatly increased risk of suicide for these children who live with non-affirming parents. And when we look at the statistics and we see that only 1 in 3 is in a household with an affirming parent, that it's hugely overwhelming to think about 2/3 of children from this population not being affirmed and being at risk for suicide, hearing day in and day out all the negativity and all the awfulness that they're hearing, and it greatly affects their mental health. So we found that 50% of these folks wanted counseling, but were unable to receive it. And that 70% said that their mental health was extremely poor during COVID. And another 80% said that their living situation was absolutely harmful during the pandemic. It's incredible to think about being in a home where health and wellness is not the norm.
Christy, when you talk about trauma, can you explain what type of trauma you mean and the difference between trauma with a big T and trauma with a small t, and how that manifests in someone's home or in someone's life?
Sure. And I think when we think about trauma, we always think about the big T. So we think about a life-threatening event. We think about a car accident, war, some big major, certain death, things like that. But what we find, especially for children and adolescents in the LGBTQ plus population, is that I call it death by 1,000 cuts. So they're suffering all these little T's, these little traumas all the time, the emotional abuse, the having to out themselves over and over again, just bullying and harassment and everything that comes on a day-to-day basis. Those are the little T's, and that's the difference.
And less opportunity to escape that if they've been inside with people who aren't supportive.
Definitely.
Thanks so much for spelling all that out, Christy. Clark, I'd love to ask you, as a therapist who works with LGBTQ plus youth, what are you witnessing? What are you hearing from young people?
I think to build off what Christy was saying is, we have these perhaps unsupportive, unaffirming families. And with COVID and with everything that's been going on, we've had a lot of transitions in what that looks like for social support for LGBTQ youth. And so we know that a lot of times those who have unaffirming families find family and connection and support in those who are peers in the school system where they spend most of their time. I guess I should also clarify that social support could also be one affirming teacher, right? So, I've worked with clients who one teacher has made that difference. And so, we've seen changes when, these students were kind of forced to be at home, not able to connect with their social support or receive the support they need from their affirming teachers, for example. So this really impacts mental health. And that's what Christy was speaking to with the increase in suicidality, things like that. So I've also seen, kind of adapting. So LGBTQ youth really adapt and are really resilient in that way of kind of using virtual and technological kind of communities to make those connections. So I've seen a definite increase in the use of some of those apps, group messaging, message boards, things like that. I will, caveat and say that I think sometimes in certain situations, some of those places there can be danger in any online, environment. But I do know that sometimes those supports were really important for a lot of clients that I've worked with. But I also want to highlight, kind of the unique and really important factor of those who have intersecting identities and multiple kind of minority identities. So I think about, clients I work with who are Black and trans, right? And so I think of those inequities and our current, political and social environment, in addition to anti-trans legislature, in addition to barriers with education and support. So you can see how these layers really add up and create lots of barriers for folks.
Clark, I'm actually wondering if in any way you think that the ability to Zoom and have these conversations remotely is ever additive to a solution. I know that I've been a part of DEI conversations for other organizations that I'm involved with, and I actually think that it's allowed more people to feel safe. I know that's not the situation for everyone, but is some of this virtual communication at all helpful? And is it something that we can incorporate as we reopen and try to pursue the best path forward?
Can this create more accessibility? Can this create more safety for some folks and opportunity? Yes, I think so. And I think, there's some unique factors where, you might have people who aren't safe in their homes who have to utilize Zoom or communicate online at maybe, aren't identifying in the way they want to at home, but then have to be in this classroom environment. And so there's a lot of challenges and kind of complexities. But I will say there are positive and additive pieces to this, online piece outside of education. So kind of like even support networks, support groups. I think we're now seeing even more development. And so to answer your second question, yes, I think that this is becoming, I think we'll see a lot more hybrid, so to speak, offerings of everything.
Thank you so much, Clark. I want to give you a chance to be a part of this conversation since you're an academic researcher and you focus on the support of trans individuals. What are some of the unique challenges that have been documented in research so far?
So just to elaborate a little bit on what Christy and Clark have mentioned, I think some of these statistics come from the Trevor Project's latest survey of 35,000 LGBTQ youth and just the impacts of the pandemic. So I really recommend that as a resource. And I think it's going to be shared. The link will be shared for that at some point. But in that, one of the statistics that stood out from that survey was that 80% of LGBTQ youth stated that COVID-19 made their living situation more stressful. So to just elaborate a little bit, in addition to youth being more vulnerable to abuse and rejection in the home, I think that there's a lot more concealment of identity. And so we know just broadly, if you have to hide your identity or conceal parts of yourself, especially when you are not wanting to do that, but you have to do that maybe for safety reasons, that has a really negative mental health impact. So for a lot of youth who do not feel safe being out at home with their parents because they might be rejected, they might be abused, they might be kicked out, right? We already see really high rates of LGBTQ youth being homeless or houseless. So I think that is another key piece, is not being able to be your authentic self. Whereas maybe youth previously, maybe they weren't out at home, but they could be out at school with their peers, or they had some situations or spaces where they could be authentic. And so that really decreased, which I think was super isolating and super hard. A couple other pieces that I wanted to mention as well. I really feel for youth generally who's gone through this past year, just because of the developmental milestones. If you think about, as a high school student, missing your homecoming dance or your prom, or going to lunch every day with your friends, and all of these things that you're kind of missing out on. And then I think for youth, this is a big time when youth are really coming into their identities or exploring their identities. Maybe they're dating for the first time. They really wanted to have an opportunity to have some of those experiences, but were really limited in that way. And I think a lot of the resources in social support groups or through GSA at school, that's where a lot of identity development or exploration happens. So I think there's a lot of grief in missing some of those milestones for youth. So that's kind of another piece. And then I'll just add one more specifically for trans youth. So if your family's unaccepting, or you're not able to be your affirmed gender at home, that's really going to increase your gender dysphoria. And so gender dysphoria is this increased distress, discomfort of when you feel like your gender and maybe your body or appearance or how other people are perceiving you or referring to you is incongruent. It's creating a lot of stress. So when trans youth are not able to wear the clothes that they want, be referred to how they want, that's going to increase a lot of distress. And gender dysphoria is highly linked to negative mental health outcomes, including suicide. And then in addition to that, there's specific unique factors for youth. So a lot of trans youth will have a really big increase in gender dysphoria when they hit puberty, because that's when their body is changing and all of these things are happening that they don't want to happen. So they're already kind of at a vulnerable state. And then if they're not able to have support from the family or have access to gender affirming care, then that can just make things so much worse. So in the beginning of the pandemic, I don't know if you all remember when the first couple months, there was a lot of, we were all in crises, but in terms of medical care, there was like this scarcity of like, we have to have all hands on deck for COVID, which makes sense. But a lot of gender affirming care, hormones and surgeries were delayed because they were considered non-essential. And so then that was a big stressor on the trans community broadly, because people already have to wait really, really long times to get that gender affirming care, and then delaying that even further, you can see how that would create more hopelessness and all of that. And for youth, there's actually specific like time periods that care needs to happen. So it's a little bit time sensitive. So just to explain briefly, there's puberty blockers or puberty suppression, hormones and surgery, but puberty blockers have to happen prior to you going through the wrong puberty. So there is a time sensitivity to that. So with those delays, then that could create a lot of additional stress and additional dysphoria. So.
Well, and in addition to all these stressors, and I've said from the beginning that I'm so glad I'm not a high school or college student during this pandemic. I feel for all of the teenagers out there, because I just wanted to be with my friends at that point in life. And obviously that's developmentally appropriate, and add on all these layers of, trans stress. I feel for these kids. On top of that, unfortunately, we've seen a lot of anti-trans legislation. What is going on there, Em? What's your perspective on that, and how is that impacting the LGBTQ+ community?
Yes, so this is a huge stressor in the past year. Yeah, we talk about like the last year and the pandemic, and then wow, so many other stressors going on in the world as well. So one of the major things I think for trans youth specifically is this uptick in anti-trans legislation. So in 2021, there's already been 100 pieces of legislation that are anti-trans. That's more pieces being proposed than in the last 10 years. So huge, huge increase. And most of the bills are targeting trans youth specifically. So there are two types of bills that have been proposed. So one is about banning trans girls from playing sports. And so some of those laws have passed in Idaho and Florida. So those are one string of bills. And then the second is about banning gender affirming medical care for youth. So banning puberty blockers and hormones, not only banning those for minors, but also criminalizing it. If you're a healthcare provider and you provide that care, then you could get criminal charges for providing that care. Even some of the legislation was so terrible. In Texas, one of the worst proposals was that if you were a parent of a trans kid and you allowed your kid to engage in some of these gender affirming medical care, you could be charged with child abuse. So perpetuating, so that bill died. Super, super happy. There was a lot of activism around that. Most of these bills have died or not been passed. But what it the impact, I think, has still been super, super big. Arkansas did pass a law that bans gender affirming care for minors and criminalizes it. But the ACLU is going to be suing them. And so hopefully that won't go into effect. But just like I've been on kind of community forums, and families and parents are saying, okay, we have to move out of Arkansas. We can't be here if our kid can't get the care that is literally life-saving. And that's what this is the one treatment that we know has such a huge impact. And I think there's this perpetuation of a lot of these myths and negative stereotypes. And so then there's more exposure, especially for trans youth, to be hearing all these arguments against their existence and against their right to play in sports. And so I think that's taking a negative toll on mental health. Yeah, I'm happy to elaborate. I have a lot to say on this.
No, I think that was super helpful to sort of contextualize what's going on that we see and read and watch in the news with the trans community, and then sort of also the internal and family mental health struggles. Our next segment, which I think is so important, is addressing the issue, because we want to move forward through this and create positive change. So Clark, I was hoping to start with you. from a mental health perspective, what is being done to help LGBTQ plus youth build resilience, and how is this happening within schools, within home, within private practice care, community organizations? Where does it all take place, and how is it happening?
I'm kind of looking at this in a bigger sense and seeing that really we're having a lot of success when we have really strong collaboration and consultation with allied providers, with mental health professionals. It's like building a strong network within the communities for folks, for referrals, things like that. I know that seems kind of a strange piece to start, but in order to kind of help foster resilience of LGBTQ youth, we need to highlight and have access to those resources, and make sure that we know that those people are affirming. So I think one of the biggest things too is for mental health professionals and educators, anyone who's referring someone somewhere to receive services, I think it's imperative that we really do our diligence in assessing if this is really an affirming provider or environment for folks. And then, a lot of times it's learning from our queer and trans youth and learning from them about their experiences of which providers and who in the community are supportive and affirming. So it's important also to listen to them. So I think this community building and collaboration piece is something that we're doing, that's successful, that we need a lot more of. I also think that, usually when we're working with people, we want to say, let's work on ways that if you're struggling, what are some ways that you can cope through that struggle, right? So I think what's important during these times is to really work on kind of like, working on ways that are both kind of hybrid. So looking at what's working for them now in their lives, what can be supported in person now that we're kind of coming back to this transitional piece, what's still supported online, really identifying and highlighting safe and supportive people for them. So I think that, kind of problem solving and planning and even safety planning, things like that with youth is really important. But, the biggest piece here is building up the resources within our communities, so that our LGBTQ students and youth aren't the ones having to really search these out themselves, that they're available to them. And yeah, so I think that's really important.
Thanks so much, Clark. And Christy, since you work actively in communities to advocate for the safety and support of LGBTQ youth, can you share what your work involves and what you're seeing people do to support this community and these kids?
We do a lot of outreach. I do a lot of webinars, trainings, conferences. Much of what we're doing today, I do with my work through, I'm also a professor. I do it through there. I do it through the agency. I go out into the community on the national level with national counseling organizations. I think it's incredibly important to get the word out. I think that all these things continue to amp up and get worse when we're quiet. And so I think that we think that, oh, well, what difference can I make? And you can make a huge difference, even in just saying something. If somebody says something to somebody and it's not right, stand up and speak out. That's how we change this stuff. Because when I know we had mentioned earlier, like the political climate of all of this, and to see about half of America go one way and half of America go the other way. And much what was happening was people being silent. When we're silent, we're complicit. And we really need to stand up and speak out and train folks, because folks want the information. They want the knowledge. They want to be better. They just don't often know how. And they're so afraid they're going to say the wrong pronoun or they're going to say the wrong thing. But they have to be able to learn and grow, or else they're stagnant and they stay in the same place. So I would say For folks, it's super important to get involved in your state organization. It's important to get involved in national organizations. I know Em included some really great resources, and I already saw one of the questions was, hey, where do we get these statistics? And the Trevor Project, huge statistics about all kinds of things that are so fiercely important, especially in mental health. I think that we need to be focused on folks who cannot leave their homes. And that was a huge focus for us at the center this year. So instead of trying to do a counseling session via Zoom with a non-affirming parent standing over their shoulder, which could lead to abuse, we went out to their houses. So you have to bring the information, you have to bring the help to them at times, especially if you know that it is unsafe to talk about these things with a non-affirming parent in the household. We also have a child abuse prevention program. So we're in all the schools in Toledo. So public, parochial, Christian, paid schools. And so we teach what's a safe and unsafe touch, who's somebody you can tell if you're being abused. What if you're not in a non-affirming home? What if you feel like hurting yourself? All of these things. And we reach out to about 10,000 students every single year. And our program, we will give to anybody. So we share that information for free because we just want kids to be safe and to be protected. Also, we made a huge push to talk to teachers and mandated reporters about how to report these things because they could be our only chance to get a hold of these children. So if you're teaching via Zoom and you see a mark on a child or you see somebody, saying a slur to their kid or whatever, you have to report that because you might be the only person that kid has to make a call like that. It's incredibly important. Community partners, our multidisciplinary team, law enforcement, children's services, mental health, hospitals. It's everybody's job to report these things, to step in and to stand up. And I would say for our center in particular, it was incredibly important for me to have folks from the LGBTQ plus community who were on staff because we have had such huge gains with our kids and our adolescents who are even questioning, like, what's my place in this world? I don't feel like a boy or a girl. Like, am I weird? What should I do about this? And to have somebody to say, I've been there. I was you. Like to affirm that is just so incredibly heartwarming and probably is saving these children's lives, honestly. And then also having representation on my board. For the first time in 47 years, I have a member of the LGBTQ plus population on my board. And so that we can make decisions from that lens. So I would say that there's lots of micro things that you can do within your community, and there's lots of macro things that you can do, but you have to be able to reach everyone from your tiniest child, adolescent, all the way up to the big folks who are making the decisions. I think it's imperative.
Thanks, Christy. And, while there are some parents out there that are unfortunately not affirming, I do think a lot of parents really mean well, but maybe they just don't have the tools or don't know how to speak to their kids. What can parents and families do to be supportive? What language can they use? What are some specific ways to speak in a positive way?
So I think in my research on resilience, one of the main things I've focused on is family acceptance and parent acceptance, just because in the research of what helps protect trans youth against these negative mental health outcomes, it's like social support, community, but family is just like the strongest protective factor. So that's why I really focused on parents. And I think what happens is a lot of parents have a lot of fear that comes up, or they feel really overwhelmed. They don't know what to do. And so I think when a fear comes up, then it can lead to some behaviors that might actually unintentionally be harmful. So for example, a lot of people will have a lot of fears that their kid's going to be made fun of, or that they're going to have a harder life. And because of that fear, they say, well, you can't wear that. Oh, I'm not going to call you that. Like, that's good. You're going to have a harder life because of that. But what they don't realize is what they're indirectly communicating is that, we don't accept you, or that's wrong, right? And so even though it might seem like you're protecting them from bullying or these external stressors, you're actually perpetuating some of those negative beliefs about themselves. So I think kind of allowing your kid to be who they are and explore and access spaces. I think something else that can help is for parents to get their own support separate from their kids. So whether that's going to support groups, and now there's lots of online support groups. In my own research, I developed an online program for parents of trans youth where they can kind of go through their own emotional process and learn about how to be supportive. But I think it's really important for parents to do their own processing. It is an adjustment period to kind of relearn your child as a different gender than what you once thought. There could be feelings of grief coming up and fear. But what happens is that sometimes parents will share all of that and unload all of that onto their kid. And then what that again can indirectly or maybe unintentionally communicate is like, you're making this really hard for me, or like, this is such a burden on me, right? And so I think that's why it's really important for parents to have support systems for parents to go to. And I think the other thing that's super scary is just that, especially for kids and youth, it's really appropriate for people to be trying on new labels, new clothes. Like, there can be a lot of fluidity, but that brings up just a lot of anxiety, because I think that parents want to know with all certainty who their kid's going to be forever. And then if they're not sure, then it's like, then we can't do any exploration. It has to be kind of this black and white. And so I think like helping parents sit with uncertainty and like sit with fluidity and kind of just tolerate that. But I think what's most important is just sharing that you support your kid no matter what, explicitly saying that, because kids have a lot of fear that you're going to be rejecting. And so even if you are supportive but you don't say that, they might think, oh, how their fears are coming true. So just that explicit support, really listening to them. And I think, what's the most important thing is that, it's a scary world out there, but if you can have an affirming place at home, we know that makes such a huge difference. So those are just a few of the main things that I will recommend to parents.
As a mother myself and a daughter, I feel like I experience both of these concurrently.
Okay.
I'm always telling my mom, you don't need to solve my problems. Sometimes I just want you to listen to them.
Right.
And I'm wondering, is that what parents sort of need to go for, that they don't need to come up with every solution right away, but just hear their kid and say, yeah, I get it.
Mm-hmm. I think the other thing too is like parents are really confused or they're anxious, so they want to know a lot of answers really quickly. So I think what happens is they might kind of bombard their kid with all these questions like, well, are you sure? How did you know? Maybe it's this, maybe it's that. And that's coming from their own kind of reaction. But how that could be impacted to the youth is that like they might feel really overwhelmed, or like they might feel like, oh, all this questioning means that you don't believe me or you're not hearing me, right? Or that there's something wrong. It must be due to something, like you really don't want me to be trans or gay or whatever it is. You want it to be about something else. So I think taking a pause, right? Doing our own emotional processing so that we can come back and not doing things out of like a very reactionary stance, but getting your own support. So then you can come back to your kid and say, I'm here to listen, like, how can I support you and what's going on, and have that conversation.
Well, and I think that goes to a conversation that's important in all mental health discussions, which is access to help. So it sounds like parents need their own support communities of peers, but then also perhaps counseling themselves so that they can process their own emotions. And that's tricky no matter what kind of conversation you're having about mental health. And actually, we do have some questions and they're sort of related to this topic. So rather than waiting to the end, I might just ask a couple of them. One of our attendees asked, what kind of support in the community is there for families with LGBTQ middle school kids? So maybe younger kids. I think people really struggle to find that specific place to go to.
I think so. One thing that I'm thinking about is that be kind of challenging because I think that's you know, I've worked in a couple different areas in a couple states, and I think that location can really impact what that looks like for resources. I have found success with eFlag is an organization, and we actually have some of these organizations and resources that we're going to share with you right there in the chat. They're all kind of emphasized on a document for you, and a lot of them are resources for families as well. But I've also found success in, you know, for example, one family looked to a local university's kind of gender and sexuality group and found that that group ran some support groups for families. So there might be some kind of investigation that you might need to do, because unfortunately, as we know, these aren't, there's not a lot of resources. So those are a couple that I think might be appropriate, and then some that we share on our document.
I'll share another resource that I think is in the follow-up resources that you all will all get, but that's Gender Spectrum, which is based in Oakland. But it's a national organization. It focuses specifically on gender, so it's more about trans and gender diverse youth. But they do have online support groups for parents, and they also have online support groups for trans youth, and then they have specific age ranges. So they do have a group that's specifically for preteens, and they have other groups. And I think those types of spaces where it's moderated and, you know, with affirming professionals, I think those are really good resources. So that's one recommendation. Also, the Trevor Project, in addition to being a crisis line, they also have a number of kind of community building resources for trans youth. So they have, I think it's called Trevor Space, and they have online chat rooms for folks, I think, as young as 13. But parents might feel a little bit more comfortable sending them to that because it is moderated. And so it's like a safer space, but you can get that community connection. So those are a couple resources I would recommend.
Thank you. I think we should move on to our third segment, which is moving forward, what more needs to be done. Clark, looking to the future, it's apparent there's so much more that we need to do in terms of raising awareness about what's happening within our LGBTQ+ youth community. You understand the importance of building networks of support within schools. And I know that you've worked with Ohio schools and you earned the Counselor of the Year from the Ohio Counseling Association. So will you share with us what you think works, what has been successful, and what lessons maybe you've found in Ohio that could be transferable to other communities and school districts?
Absolutely. So I think briefly, to share, I was afforded the National Board for Certified Counselors Minority Fellowship grant, which enabled me, as part of my fellowship program, to create a kind of a panel, a board, advisory board of folks with different specialties, but all who have knowledge and awareness and are passionate about working with LGBTQ youth. And so this organization acts as a kind of a resource for schools. So local Northwest Ohio schools were given this information, as well as our information for the panel, so that they have opportunity to ask questions. Because what we're finding is there's like a huge disconnect, and that folks in schools then aren't always receiving the best information or don't know how to gain information. So we're trying to bridge that gap and bring the information right into the schools, right into the hands of administration and educators, and staff members. So I think that's kind of one of my personal areas of passion, and leads to really this bigger need for affirmative training of educators, staff, anyone that works within a school system. So I think that this needs to be a mandatory trainings, not just kind of a, you know, I might select this training on my professional development day, because everyone, you know, in some way is interacting with these folks. So I think we really need to see increased trainings. I also think that goes with medical professionals, legal professionals, allied helping professionals. We really need to just increase the awareness and get some good education out to folks. I think the other last pieces I'll talk about are, this was highlighted before, but really bringing bringing much more visibility to our LGBTQ communities and youth. And so, I'm thinking in a school framework, but what does this look like as far as our curriculum, right? And so how inclusive are we of diverse identities and representations of family structures and gender diversity, things like that within our curriculum, as well as hearing from and highlighting the voices of LGBTQ folks. So whether that looks like, Christy was talking about including LGBTQ folks on your advisory boards and panels and in decision-making processes. And also, having these voices in our school systems, for example. So imagine how powerful that might be for a student, maybe struggling with their sexuality or coming to terms with it, and then seeing someone come in and talk about their experiences. Again, just like we were talking about before, that modeling can be so important. So I think, it's hard to encompass this in an hour. There's so much to do, but I think those are a few pieces I think are good starting places.
Well, and Christy, I want to ask you this, and I'm really looking forward to the explanation. Can you explain the significance of being LGBTQ plus friendly versus LGBTQ plus competent?
Yeah, that's, several years ago, I remember that folks were kind of touting themselves as I'm LGBTQ plus friendly, which is fantastic, but it doesn't mean that you're competent. So competent means that you've had some training, that you're doing some research, that you're staying up to date on best practices. It's kind of like the difference between sympathy and empathy. Like sympathy, somebody comes up to you and says something, you're like, man, sucks to be you, kind of thing. And empathy is like, wow, I remember when that happened to me and that really was tough, kind of thing. So it's so different. It's actually sitting with a person and understanding where they're coming from and understanding as much as you can by not walking in their shoes, but by having the best case scenario for them. So not just saying, welcome, it's a safe space, like really creating that safe space through knowledge and research and that empathic spirit, much of what we teach in counseling, genuineness and unconditional positive regard and all of those things to make it feel like a safe space. So, and in doing that, I think it's really important that you show that. So, for instance, behind me, you can see my pride flag. It's not your typical rainbow flag, which I've seen a lot of folks flying that this month of Pride, which I'm super excited about. I have never in my lifetime seen so many apps lit up, so many, different pieces of folks saying like, hey, it's Pride Month. And I'm so excited because I feel like the tide is turning. But also in the flag behind me, you will see Black, brown, and you will see trans represented behind me. And so that's what's missing from the typical rainbow flag. And so folks need to recognize, much like what Clark said earlier, the intersectionality of all of this. And so that right there is a competence-based practice. So that's more LGBTQ plus competent than friendly, recognizing that it is much harder for an African-American trans person than it would ever be for a Caucasian gay male any day of the week. So just knowing those things are really incredibly important.
Well, and Christy, we've sort of had this conversation when it comes to the important BIPOC conversation that's happened over the past year since George Floyd was murdered. And that's that shouldn't be up to the Black community or the Latino community or the LGBTQ plus community or that one person in your office or your friend group to educate everyone else on these important issues. So what can people do to educate themselves?
It goes back to what I was talking about earlier. You want to attend webinars and workshops and conferences. You want to read the latest research. You want to know what best practice is. I mean, I've had so many trans friends who tell me they go to their medical professional and they have to teach them what they don't know. And the onus is on them. And how incredibly exhausting and how disaffirming, and how uncelebratory is that I have to tell you how to take best care of me. And Em also posted a great resource about medical care and what folks need to know when they're treating transgender folks. So it's incredibly important. And I'm seeing a shift more recently that at least these resources are becoming better seen, I would say, because folks they're making an outcry for it and they need them so desperately. And you can't go to just a regular practitioner and get what you need. And it's so incredibly important for us to have these resources, and you won't have them everywhere. You know, you might have them in New York and San Francisco and all of these things. And that's why it's so important as a teaching school that we teach our students where these resources are, and if they're not readily available, how you can get to them, that we have internet resources, that we have blogs, that we have places for folks to go to get that affirming space, because they're not everywhere.
Totally. Yeah. And I just wanted to follow up a little bit on that, kind of not burdening LGBTQ people to educate. I think what happens is people kind of just expect that labor and expect it for free. Like, oh, you're LGBTQ, so you must be an expert in this area, or kind of asking those questions. However, there's a little bit nuance, because I think then LGBTQ people that are experts in the field, then they're kind of excluded from these mainstream organizations, or pushed out. So I feel like not assuming that somebody that is their expertise, but for LGBTQ people, when it is their expertise, really listening and centering their voices and paying them for their labor. So I just think I can think of a lot of larger national organizations that were kind of like, for example, WPATH, and historically, which is the World Professional Association of Transgender Health, was kind of started by and predominantly with cis providers. So I think one way that you can kind of sift through the educational resources is to follow LGBTQ people, follow their social media, and see what resources they recommend, so that you can really vet the resources in saying, like, how is the actual LGBTQ community responding to this? And so I think that's one strategy that folks can use. The other thing I wanted to just highlight was, I think it kind of goes along with what Christy was saying. Yeah, it's one thing to kind of work on our own biases to be affirming, but I really want to push for advocacy as well, especially, obviously, I talked about all this anti-trans legislation. So we really need a lot of advocacy to push back against this. So even if you're not in a state that has some of these laws, you can still call the governor. So a lot of the reasons that these bills failed was because of people calling governors, and then governors ended up vetoing those bills. I hate talking on the phone, but I even mustered up the courage to go and actually make that call. And there's ongoing resources about, here's the states where there's legislation coming up, here's who you can call, or here's who you can email. And then, another way that I think you can advocate is for educating yourself against these negative messages that are being perpetuated by these laws. So, for example, I think a lot of these laws are kind of based on these myths or these fears of there's this problem that actually doesn't actually exist, but we need to fix this problem with this legislation. So it used to be with bathroom bills. I don't know if you remember. So 2015, there was a wave of bathroom bills, and the problem, quote unquote, was that trans women were going to be dangerous or attack cis women or cis girls in bathrooms. Well, that actually didn't exist. That wasn't actually documented. That was just kind of perpetuated. So I think, if you can look and educate yourself about what's actually going on, and actually trans people were the ones being harassed and attacked in bathrooms, and similar things are going on with these other bills that's kind of perpetuating these fears of problems that are actually non-existent. So I think if you can keep up with how to have those arguments against some of these misconceptions, and then being able to talk to friends and family about it, or post that education, that's a way to advocate. So those are just a few of my suggestions.
Thanks so much. It is time for questions. Shannon says some of our panelists have mentioned that they host or are involved with webinars and other online spaces where they support LGBTQ youth. How do LGBTQ youth benefit from these Zooms or webinars? She's sort of wondering about the gap that might exist between academics and professionals and actual LGBTQ youth community members. So how do we have these great important conversations, but then actually reach the kids who need help?
And that's what I had talked about earlier. We were able to reach 10,000 students last year, and we reached 10,000 students every single year. So we are in all the schools in this area. So that's how we're bridging that gap. We're in there and we're talking to them about these issues and who to tell if they're being abused, if they're questioning their sexuality, anything like that. We're having them, we're hooking them up with resources. They can come and talk to us. And so anything to do with orientation, identity, anything like that, we are in the schools. And so I would say that most folks are making a bigger push to get, like I said, outreach into the community. So we knew that if we also talk with our community partners as well. And so if there's an issue, they refer to us. And like I said, we will go out to the home and actually do counseling on the front porch, in the backyard, at the library, wherever we can get a hold of them without the non-affirming folks.
Yeah, I love all the outreach that you're doing, Christy, because there are so many barriers to getting mental health care. I think some other things that are being tried out a little bit is, creating these online resources to reach youth. This was already kind of happening to reach youth in rural areas, but using social media platforms, using things on Instagram and things like that. And maybe mental health apps if you can't see a therapist, or text-based apps. I know that's been an increase, because, for example, LGBTQ youth, if they're at home and they're not out to their parents, or their parents aren't affirming, then maybe they can't do teletherapy because of privacy reasons. So how can we outreach to them through like text-based apps or other things? So this is all very new. I'm not an expert in it, but I just know that those are some of the things I think people are doing to bridge the gap.
Yeah, I mean, TikTok, I'm by no means an expert, but I know so many young people who are using that as a resource for education and information. So yeah, I'm wondering how social media channels and all the new ones that are popping up are being used to reach these kids who are undoubtedly playing on their phones or iPads. Another question, and we were sort of just talking about this, Kit says, based on the 2/3 of youth living in unaffirming environments, what can we expect to see in the increase of complex trauma and treatment approaches for these coming years? How are trainings and counseling approaches addressing both the increase in the need for support and the depth complexity of the way trauma is developing in this population?
I'm thinking about that I am seeing in counselor education training programs specifically, an increase in trauma-informed care and trauma-informed lens from with which to work with LGBTQ folks. And so I am seeing it in our programs. And I think that we'll see that kind of bleed into the supervision and kind of like how that leads to clinicians using more trauma-informed care. So I do see a pattern, and I do see that it's going to be essential that we're treating trauma. I think that's like really important.
And I think kind of what I talked about earlier with the little t and the big T, recognizing that it's not like folks come out one time and that's it, and it's celebrated and everybody's fantastic about it. It's coming out to your family, and it's coming out to your friends, and coming out to your coworkers. And now I've moved, and now I do all of that all over again. Or maybe I don't, because it's something personal to me. And so kind of knowing not only that it's complex trauma, that it's levels of trauma, and that it's happening insidiously sometimes for folks. So I think that that's really imperative as we learn and grow as counselors of how we react to that. Like I said earlier, death by a million cuts, it's happening every day, all the time. I know I was teaching residency one time in Phoenix, Arizona, and I had a student in my class that self-identified as a lesbian. And she walked across the street to get a cup of coffee. Okay, that is it. She walked across there and somebody said some pretty disgusting things to her, called her derogatory terms for a lesbian, and said, "You're disgusting, get out of here," and all of that. And so she comes back over to residency and she's visibly upset, and we talk about it, and I get her to calm down and kind of regulate. 2 days later, she goes over with a group of friends from residency, so fellow students. Thing happens, and the guy actually physically body checks her, and so got physical with her and called her the F word, and just all kinds of ugliness. And she came back and she was just sobbing and just absolutely horrified. And so what I did was I knew that we had a CES student, so a counselor education and supervision doc student upstairs, who was also a lesbian. And I said, "Can you please come down here and speak with her?" And that is what really helped her to get through, was somebody who knew from which she spoke. And so what's great about that, and when I think about going forward in counselor education and in really being helpful in this realm, is getting those voices. So getting voices from the LGBTQ plus population to inform our best practices and our decision making. And so I see that a lot more than we've ever had. Instead of, "I've done this research and this is what I think," or what, actually going to the community and finding out what is incredibly helpful, I think will inform our best practices.
I'm wondering just if we can have a conversation about pronouns. It's become a new topic that a lot of people discuss, and people put them in their Zoom names and they add them to their email signatures. And I think there's a lot of questions out there about how we handle pronouns. And then also, I'm curious for all the panelists, if you read the New York Times article on neopronouns, which I found completely fascinating and very new for me. And how can people who are allies and who are trying to do more than just be friends, Christy, like we were talking about, but be LGBTQ plus competent, how can we incorporate pronouns in our life and be sensitive to that and learn about them?
I would say it's such a wonderful and great thing, but we also have to be mindful that people are not ready for that. So for example, I have an employee here, and we were doing a training for our staff to be more confident. And the trainer actually said, "I want to go around and I want everybody to say their pronoun." When they got to this person, and this person said they, them, no one knew that. They assumed that it was she and her, and it was not. And so she had to out herself in that situation. So I would say we have to be very, very cautious. So if we say, "Hey, throw that on your email, throw that on your tagline," if you're comfortable, okay? Because this person did not want to disclose this information because they were very fearful that some of the community partners that we worked with would think of this person differently. And so we have to be very cautious with our pronouns. They are an incredibly useful tool for folks to know how to address us. But also we have to be mindful of that piece as sort of a cautionary tale.
Can I add a follow-up to that, Chrissy? I have a lot about thoughts about pronouns, and as somebody that uses they, them pronouns, it's complicated. It's a little bit nuanced, I think, like you were saying. I think if we don't give space for people to be able to share their pronouns, then pronouns are going to be assumed, and oftentimes they're assumed incorrectly. So unless I share what my pronouns are, people will not use the correct pronouns, and that feels very painful for me. So, but at the same time, some people are figuring it out. And, you know, your pronouns are not the same as what your gender is, but there are a lot of assumptions that people make. So when I say my pronouns are they, them, people might assume that I'm trans or non-binary, which I am. So what I kind of advise for folks is to take this approach of, let's normalize sharing pronouns. Let's create a space where there's opportunities and we can invite people to share their pronouns, and let's not force anybody to share their pronouns. So that's how I've kind of, you know, instead of like going around and making everybody share their pronouns, saying, would like to invite you to introduce yourself with your name and your pronouns if you feel comfortable. And I think when cis people share their pronouns, for me personally, it makes me feel a lot more comfortable sharing my pronouns, because then it's an indicator to me that other people are kind of aware of that or paying attention to pronouns. But when I'm the only person to share my pronouns and nobody else does, it also is kind of stressful for me, because then it is like, okay, like all this attention is on me, versus if it's kind of normalized practice. So I think it's a really nuanced conversation, but that's kind of like a general guideline that I like to give.
And what about cisgender people who don't feel comfortable sharing their pronouns? It's new for a lot of cisgender people too. I don't know what I'm genuinely asking, because I've had these conversations with all sorts of people through work and in my own community.
I think that's a very interesting question. I think that as part of my practice and what I teach in counselor ed is that reflective piece. And so I think, well, I would never force someone to share their pronouns. I guess I would probably give some prompts or kind of reflective questions back to that person or back to you, and kind of just to maybe think about your gender ID formation, how you see yourself. Have you ever experienced maybe gender related discrimination, questions that kind of get the juices flowing, so to speak, and get you to think about your gender. And it's something that can, for someone as I identify as a cisgender man, that it doesn't take anything for me to say my pronouns. I can just say my pronouns, and what a powerful thing that can create that safety for someone else. Then I'm gonna say my pronouns. So I do understand kind of like the complexity and kind of thought around that. And I do want to add one more thing, if I can, Kate, about pronouns, which is, I think for many of us, it's like, what if I say the wrong thing? And if I say the wrong thing, what do I do? And I think that's a question that we should address. And I know that research, and I'm sure M has seen this in their research as well, as far as apologizing, taking that correction, moving forward, but not really dwelling on it, and not making that person who is who you I don't know, microaggress towards, or who making that trans or gender expensive person have that burden of explaining themselves or educating you or making you feel better about yourself if you over apologize for saying that. So I just wanted to bring that up as far as having that discussion, because it can happen, and I think that we need to acknowledge that.
There's one thing that I read that was sort of interesting today, and it was in relation to a Billie Eilish article. I don't know if you guys follow Billie Eilish or like her. I do. I'm a big fan of her music. But someone was writing about her, and so the issue of coming out came up. And is the idea of coming out antiquated because it suggests that you're other than heterosexual? And obviously, I think it's important within your own families and communities, because you need to tell your loved ones what's going on. But that really struck a chord with me, and I find it sort of just an interesting think piece. And is it important? Why is it important to come out? I think it's important for awareness, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. I hadn't really read that anywhere before.
Well, I think it's comical, really, kind of, because nobody asks a cisgender heterosexual, when did you come out? I mean, it just doesn't happen. And so we put all this stuff on LGBTQ folks and say, oh, well, you got to come out, or you got to celebrate this, or here's a day for you, or what. They're on their own timeline. Like, come on. And anybody that I know who has ever done it has, the amount of stress and pain and tears and everything. So I think it's interesting that we think about 10% plus of the population, that we have all of this stress on them about these situations, and the rest of the folks, we just don't even have any. I know I'm not being clear, but it's just there's no big fanfare, there's no big huge thing. And so I'm going to turn it over to Em and Clark, because I would love to hear their thoughts on this.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, the only reason that there is a closet is because people make heteronormative and cisnormative assumptions. Like everybody is straight and cis by default. And so that's the only reason that you have to say that actually that's not true for you. And I think, yeah, flipping the script can be really helpful. Thinking about youth, a lot of people say, well, how could you know that you're straight? Or how could you know that you're lesbian or gay or bisexual? How could you know that you're trans? You're too young. But we never question cis or straight youth about those same questions. So I think flipping the script like that it can be helpful to illuminate, like, oh, why are we making these assumptions?
And I think that speaks to kind of what I was saying before, about asking folks, asking parents, asking families about their experiences of when they knew their sexuality, when they knew their gender. How did they come to know that? How did that impact them? Things like that. I think those questions are important as well.
Thank you, guys. Thanks for answering my questions too.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.